Around 250,000 people, along with world leaders, are bidding their final goodbyes to Pope Francis at his funeral in Baroque Plaza in front of St. Peter's Basilica at the Vatican, where he's being remembered as a pope among people with a heart for everyone. Among the world leaders present are US President Donald Trump, Prince William, French President Emmanuel Macron, former US President Joe Biden, Ukrainian President Zelensky, along with Indian President Draupadi Murmu, Union Minister Kiran Rijiju, among others. The service ends with prayers for Pope Francis and a final commendation, a concluding prayer where the Pope will formally be entrusted to God according to rituals. This marks the beginning of a 9-day mourning period. Amid all the tributes, there's also skepticism if Presidents Trump and Zelensky use the opportunity of being in the same place to discuss the prospects of a ceasefire in Ukraine. Well, they both were seen sitting in the front row, but away from each other in the visuals, at least, that were seen. They will be seated in an area at the St. Peter's Square allocated to the world leaders in alphabetical order by country. But first, here's a special report on why there's been such immense outpouring of love.
Nel nome del Padre, del Figlio e dello Spirito Santo.
He emerged from the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica in 2013, asking the crowd to pray for him before offering his first blessing.
Fratelli e sorelle, buonasera.
A simple gesture that set the tone for an extraordinary papacy. Pope Francis was the first Jesuit, the first Latin American and the first non-European pope in more than 1,200 years. But it was his message of mercy, justice and inclusion that truly broke new ground. Including the iconic "Who am I to judge?", a statement that echoed around the world as he disarmed critiques over his compassionate view on LGBTQ rights. The Pope also had a refreshingly progressive take on climate change. In 2015, he issued Laudato Si, a powerful call to action on climate change, winning praise from scientists, world leaders and activists alike.
While regretting to have to do so, I must renew my repeated appeals.
His papacy was global in reach but deeply personal. He washed the feet of prisoners, embraced the sick and visited war-torn zones, choosing humility over hierarchy. Pope Francis inherited a church shaken by scandal. He promised accountability and set up commissions, but survivors often said, more action, less apology. His legacy has remained mixed. The Pope's demise has been mourned by heads of states of all countries with varying religious character. Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who met him less than a year ago, said he was deeply pained by the Pope's passing and remembered him as a beacon of compassion, humility and spiritual courage. Pope Francis died at his residence in the Vatican, surrounded by his closest aides. As the Church enters a period of mourning and begins preparing to elect a new Pope, his words linger. Let us not forget to pray for each other. Bureau Now report.
He chose to be Pope Francis, keeping in mind Saint Francis of Assisi, perhaps the greatest man in Europe of that era. Secondly, he was a man who lived very simply. He had disdain for the magnificence that popedom would lead to. And he lived in a very simple apartment, not the papal apartment. That's the second thing. Thirdly, it has to be said that he was extremely liberal and he had problems with other senior officials in the Roman Catholic Church. As a result of that, because some of his decisions proved to be a little liberal and it did not meet the approval of a lot of people. Fourthly, he looked back at the history of the church and went to darker areas. He felt that the church could have done more for the Jews between, let's say, 1935 to 1945. And the church could have done much, much more, is what he had said. He opened up parts of the church's documents of that era as well. He was also, being an Argentinian and the first from South America, a football fan. Of course, this is in a lighter note. And his love for football is well known. But the most important contribution, of course, was he was seen as a liberal pope, in many ways a change from some of his predecessors. A lot of his decisions were very pro-people. He lived simply, and he wanted other religious officials, other leaders, religious leaders of the church to live as simply as they could. And this was a reason why he could reach out to people. People loved him for just that alone, apart from his liberalism and also his very simple lifestyle. Here is a man who becomes a pope, who decides he will not live in this very expansive papal apartment, but live in a simple Vatican City guest house inside the Vatican. Now that is a gesture that will not be forgotten. And of course, his love for the environment. If nothing else, he said that we are reducing the world into an area of filth. And he was a strong proponent of fighting climate change, of fighting global warming. Now, these are very big things a pope can do, because a pope's voice is an important voice. And in this fight against global warming, the pope's voice matters. And even if it has had some impact on the world, in Europe, in Asia, in Latin America, it would be such a big thing.
Well, it's no surprising that Pope Francis is being remembered as people's pope. That's all we have for you in this bulletin, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us.